very, very much for having me. Are we okay? I shall continue. I'm going to stay. Thank you very, very much for having me, and I'm really, really glad that this whole event is happening and that we're able to talk about this together. Before we begin, I'll just give you a quick visual description of what I look like. I'm a white woman with blondish hair, need a trip to the hairdressers, a lilac top, sitting downstairs, the kitchen table and a white wall behind me. I've got a cat somewhere, I've got my kids' scribbles on the wall, and because I'm obviously from England, I've got a cup of tea, and I hope you all also have cups of tea with you to enjoy during this informal session. Before we sort of get going with this whole session and this chat, I really wanted to talk about hope. Quite often, I think, when we're talking around the problems in academia, it's very easy to get dragged into everything that's wrong, and I think we all recognise there is a lot wrong. And I think when we're talking about mental health, we also can get caught up in things that leave us feeling quite demoralised, quite exhausted, perhaps, you know, just feeling very flat. So I like to try and challenge myself that I'm going to be hopeful as well as outline problems. And I find the words of the writer Raymond Williams very helpful in this. He said, "To be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing." So you can test me later on if you feel like I managed to do that. And I hope I don't sort of make you all feel thoroughly miserable at the end of what sounds like it's been a very, very successful day. To give you a bit of context, I got into this work over 20 years ago. I was working, all my research has always been on sensitive topics. And a lot of the work I was doing was often in risky and unsafe areas. You would think that I would have had some sort of supervision or protection, but I did not. So I had to look for ways to keep myself safe while I was doing research. And as a consequence, I then started being invited to go and do talks and training at universities to other people who were also doing research and field work. And I found during pretty much every one of those talks, somebody, maybe more than one person, would draw me to one side at the end and say, "Well, you've told us how to keep safe and look after our mental health in terms of field work and being out there, but my problems are in the university. It is the university that makes me unsafe. It's the university that makes me unwell. It may be that I'm experiencing racism or bullying or abuse or homophobia," but there was always something that people were reporting, often multiple problems, and they didn't know really where to go with that. So that work led on to me doing quite a lot of research on bullying in academia. And then I think, as many of us will recognise, there are multiple problems within universities, particularly around things like precarity, competition, sort of neoliberal practices, managerialism, presenteeism. Pretty much anything that ends in an ism is a problem in a university. The whole kind of idea of metrics and sort of measurement and expectations within a kind of atmosphere that I think we are wanting to go to university. I've worked as a cleaner in a university. I've worked in doing research in universities. I've done admin in universities. I wanted to do all those jobs. They were all things I wanted to do and to a greater or less extent enjoyed. But you know, the system that you work in is often very difficult. Some of us arrive at university with mental health problems, and some of us find that they develop during our time in university for all sorts of reasons. And sometimes it's the university that causes or worsens them. And so a lot of the work I started off, which was more or less basic safety training, has over the last 5 years really morphed into much more around safety plus wellbeing plus mental health. And that work is sort of balanced with the things I do as an agony aunt. So that's an advice columnist. It might be a phrase you use depending on where you are in the world. So I work in print and online and broadcast media answering people's problems, which has got nothing to do with university, but it's very, very interesting nonetheless. And so I think with that kind of context that I think we're all very familiar with, so I'm not going to go on about it at length, we were really in a very bad position in most universities worldwide when the pandemic hit. You know, I don't think it was great for anybody, but I think if you're in a system that's already broken, then you add to it a pandemic, and then perhaps depending on where you are located, or your own home situation, it could be much more difficult. If, for example, you're living somewhere where there wasn't a particularly good government response to the pandemic, or if your university didn't respond especially well, or it might be that because of your home situation, it was unsafe and tricky. So in many ways, you know, the things that we're all facing now are partly related to the inherent and systemic problems in universities, and they're partly caused or worsened by the pandemic. And those might be things that you yourselves are currently trying to deal with. Bereavement is one, loss, a lot of us feeling very angry, fearful, burnout, I think all of us relate to and are experiencing to a lesser or greater degree. Quite a lot of people are uncertain and confused. You know, if we're returning to face-to-face teaching, about the safety of that, the safety of our students, the safety of our colleagues, people aren't sure really in terms of, are we still online or are we offline? The pressure to overwork has been relentless. Some people have actually done very well in the pandemic. Inequalities have grown, and those are predictably, with minoritized people, have fallen even further behind. We've seen an increase in digital surveillance. We've seen a lot of problems around people balancing home learning for those who have children who are parents or carers, but also people struggling with loneliness, with isolation, with estrangement, with boredom, all kinds of things going on. And it's quite important, I think, to note as the new academic year begins that we have a cohort of undergraduate first years coming in who've had 2 years of quite significant disruption with their learning, with their home life, who are, you know, quite uncertain, who are quite anxious, are unsure, have probably missed out on a lot of study techniques and just basic skills that we were going to probably have to teach and maybe don't know we have to do, and are particularly struggling around anxiety, depression, eating disorders are big problems in that cohort that schools and colleges have seen, but I don't know that universities are quite yet prepared for that to come to them. So one of the things I find helps, or people tell me helps, is to think about when we're looking at who is impacted by things, whether that's problems in university, that's mental health issues, whether that's the pandemic or all of those things together, is to say, who am I bringing in? Who am I leaving out? Who might this help? And who might this harm? And it's a very small and what seems like a simple phrase that I use a lot in my teaching, but it's really inviting us to start thinking around when we're going to put something into place, or perhaps we've seen another university doing something and we think, well, that's a good idea, or we've read about it in a book, or someone shared it in a blog post, there's something going on, that we think, okay, well, who will that include, but who will it leave out? And is this actually going to help or not? And a good example of this is mindfulness. So quite often that's suggested, it's been very popular outside academia, but with the pandemic, I think it was seen as something, you know, that we could be sent a mindfulness video or something, an activity to do. And lots of people love it. It's very, very popular. Some people find it quite difficult. I have to say, I've never, ever managed to get to grips with it, but a lot of people I work with do like it a lot. So I would say, you know, you know, who am I bringing in? I'm bringing in the people who like mindfulness, but who might I be leaving out? It doesn't necessarily always work. It can make people feel much more anxious. It can make people feel more traumatized. Some people find it very complicated to understand. It doesn't really do much if everything else around you isn't changing. And that's something I think I've been particularly interested in work-wise over the last few years, and again in the responses to the pandemic on mental health, around the fact that we are good at doing stuff at the moment. So there's quite a lot of activities, and I'll ask you in a minute perhaps to share things that you're doing. And I would say the majority of it is entirely positively motivated, and lots of it is great. But we have a problem around the fact that there's lots of doing, there's less evaluation, there's less checking, is it working? And I think there's also the issue of thinking, who does that leave out? So if we're going to put something into place that is not accessible, or actually makes people feel isolated, or perhaps is created for particular audiences, and I'll talk about that in a minute, we are going to be leaving a lot of people behind, and the left behinds are growing with the pandemic anyway. But also I think we have the issue of creating materials and resources and activities that seem like they're going to be really good, but perhaps aren't necessarily helpful if everything else isn't fixed. So I think a lot of people, and you may have all found this yourselves, that it's becoming quite challenging now to do mental health work in university settings, because people have moved from being quite panicked at the start of the pandemic to kind of trying to adjust and being given things like, you know, a wellbeing webinar or something to read or an activity, but they're still being asked to overwork. They're still being tasked to do pastoral care that they're not trained for. They're still having to work in their room, and they're struggling with that. And the system around them hasn't changed. And then externally to that, services have been cut. We've got whole problems of climate change, cultural unrest in a lot of places, political unrest and uncertainty, the sort of problems with racism and sexism and homophobia, and all of the things, ableism, that have either not gone away or have amplified or worsened in the last few years, I think means that people feel very cynical at this point. Not everybody, but lots of people feel quite cynical, that you say, actually, I've got something to help you, that they are unsure that it's worthwhile, or they're unsure of you, or they're mistrustful perhaps of your motives. So I think this is partly why I said about having some hope at the beginning, because I probably made you all feel thoroughly miserable with this, but I think it's helpful to give us some kind of context. So I think before we go on, we're going to finish in a minute for some chats, but before we move forward, I just wondered if you could just perhaps put in the chat, who are you most concerned about currently? So it might be yourself, but it might be people you're researching or supporting. If you could just quickly, you know, type in who are the cohort or individuals that you are most concerned about. I'll see if I can have a look at that. Yeah, so my colleagues, so, oh, that's interesting. So you're worried about the people who are helping, caring for the carers. So who are you concerned about? Yeah, the caring for the carers one is a big issue. And I think there's a point here also about master students, which wasn't in response to this question, but is actually relevant, is that the amount of work master students are doing and the lack of help. You're absolutely right with that one. I think that the postgraduates have felt very left behind. Okay, so family, so international students, people are saying graduate students, yes, postdocs, yeah, lots and lots of people I think are being you know, raised as an issue. Disabled students, yeah, absolutely. I think that point there is saying, somebody said here about going back to normal is scary. I think that's it, that we've had this whole issue that although there has been a lot wrong with our pandemic response, the shift to online has in many ways been more inclusive. Not completely, but the fact that we're doing this, these Zoom calls make it better. And I think people are very anxious that some of the accommodations that were made, we're going to lose. And I think, yes, someone said here, normal is not working for everyone, and it's never been exactly. We're not going back to a normal. So I think those are really interesting about when we talk about who we're bringing in or leaving out. when you think about who is the most vocal in the conversation, so I would say these are the people who are generally brought in, and particularly on social media. But I think when we think about funders and sort of charities and other organisations, who is the people that has the main voice? And I would say, and it's with no, I'm not saying that these people don't have problems, because they clearly do, and that's why they're talking about them so much. But I think when we look at the spaces occupied by the discussions around mental health for academia, it's predominantly occupied by those that are white, who've got funding, who are full-time. They're usually STEM postgraduates or early career researchers, and they're usually in the UK, the US, possibly Canada or Australia, and they will be talking about having a lot of problems in the workplace, particularly with PIs and lack of supervision and care, bullying and unpleasant working spaces. And they'll talk about mental health in terms of mild to moderate mental illness, and it's usually anxiety and possibly depression. And those are all entirely appropriate things to be talking about. And I think if you're working in a place where your PI is dreadful, then you are going to be struggling. But I think we've just seen, just from some of the things that we've talked about, people who are left out. As you'll see at the end, I'm going to give you a link to a longer blog post I've written that kind of goes through this in depth, because we haven't really got time to do it in this session. And I really want to hear your questions. But I think it's worth noting that we've got a lot of people who are sharing, talking about things, giving solutions, offering support, and I would count myself in that, actually. But we are leaving behind or leaving out lots of people, our scholars and friends in the Global South, for example, people in resource poor communities, people who are struggling to access education, and all of the other things that we've already talked about sort of added to that problem. You know, so for example, if you're struggling with disability in, say, the UK, and you're trying to access university spaces, it's difficult, but you might find in other resource poor countries, it's more difficult still for other reasons. And I think we don't really hear those voices. And when people do try and talk about it, they're either spoken for or spoken over, or they're made to feel, you know, unreasonable for talking. And you may have experienced this as well, that when conversations are happening that you feel that is not actually representing you or the people you're trying to assist, that it can become quite difficult or challenging. Because I think at the moment we're all trying to do something, we're all trying to do our best, we're not just trying to change the system and improve academia, but we're all mostly coming from a position of personal experience. So, you know, when we're trying to talk about our own needs, we may not intend to overstep, but then sometimes we do. And I think the longer the pandemic goes on, the more we're seeing the impact of that. And a lot of the time it's burnout, and a lot of the time it's trauma, that actually we are finding it quite difficult to really go with this. I think particularly Indigenous students, first generation, LGBTQ+. We talked about disabled and chronically sick already, people with long COVID. There's a whole range of people that I think want to contribute, but when they do, feel like they are sidelined, which can again increase trauma. Briefly, because I think we're coming on to our chat in a minute, what are universities doing? I was going to tell you a few things that I've seen that universities have been trying to do. And that excludes, I think, ventures like this one, where this is a grassroots activism, where people are trying to actually change things from within university systems, from a position of actually recognising that their needs are not being catered for. So there's quite a lot of activity, I think, going on with people setting up their own social media groups, their own websites, their own activities, their own volunteering, which are fantastic. We've also got universities offering mental health first aid, or what they might call psychological first aid. So that's sort of short-term training to help people help others. We have wellbeing events, so things like mental health days, mental health weeks, mental health months. Online supports, we talked already about webinars or sending you resources. We have activities like the aforementioned mindfulness, therapy pets. One university in the UK had a visit from the therapy alpacas, which I was a bit jealous of. I don't know if they help, but you know, I'd welcome the therapy alpacas any day, really. Friendship Benches is a project that's launched from Zimbabwe, where you have sort of places where people can kind of just congregate and be there together. Frazzle Cafes is basically a kind of get together for those feeling exhausted. People going on retreats and counselling. I've just seen in the comments, yes, alpacas, yes. I don't know why, but yes, they did that. I just wondered, as we go through, perhaps there's stuff alongside, you know, what we're doing here, of activities you know of, or you've done, or you enjoyed, that you might want to just quickly again put in the chat that we can have a look at to see if anyone's been doing things. And I'm just looking back at some of the. Somebody said here, people are getting the most voice time are the people who are doing fine during normal times, and not the people who were never fine and things just got worse for them. I think that's a really good point. There was something quite interesting, I think, when the pandemic first started, that a lot of people who've been really struggling with severe mental illness or other problems in life, or disadvantage, said, actually, oh, hang on a minute, I know how to do this. I've been through this before, and I'm actually quite well prepared. And I think, strangely, not did better, but actually coped relatively well, because it was not a surprise. It was something that was new. But then I think with the inequalities and things that have emerged since, it's become far, far harder. So, okay, so some suggestions people have been doing: embroidery, art, yeah, knitting, painting, lovely. So, and I think some universities have done that in a formal way, and some people have done kind of get-togethers through Zoom and catch-ups, and some I think are planning more for online learning, or sorry, in face-to-face learning, and some of it is things we did. Oh, cats, yeah, excellent, good choice. I'm glad you said that. That's very good. I can't say my cats have been really very helpful in the pandemic, but you know, hopefully your cat is nicer. So a rescue bunny. See, this is great. I think collating these things sometimes about our hobbies or our things that we've tried to do are ways that we can feel connected and sharing. They're not kind of short-term things that we can just do as a solution, but I think that we've all found lots of coping strategies and connections with other people as a consequence that have been really good. So just to kind of summarize kind of where we're at, I think there's lots of things being done that's been great, but it's interesting where you shared what you were doing. A lot of it was stuff you were doing yourselves, and that's partly because we've been stuck at home, but I think it also represents that a lot of universities have not really grasp that mental health needs to happen through systemic change in the institution. So the institution needs to overhaul and change, for starters, but also that they haven't necessarily been engaging with us in the ways that we've found helpful. And perhaps actually if they told us to adopt a bunny, we would think, well, that's ridiculous because you're making me work too hard. But we might feel that if they were trying to change our working conditions and also talk about, you know, maybe a virtual coffee morning, we might feel a bit more open to that. But one of the problems I think we have at the moment is that we have activity mistaken for impact. I'm slightly sort of cynical about the word impact, because I think a lot of us are aware, especially if we work in development or healthcare, that impact is a phrase that we're kind of held to all the time, and that it can sometimes be as detrimental to us as anything else because we're pressured to prove an impact has happened. You know, I don't think we need to prove that having a cat has been a nice thing for you. I think it was just a nice thing. However, if I decide that I'm going to do a campus-wide cat provision program, I need to show that that actually worked and had some kind of impact. So doing the thing is being mistaken, I think, for actually making something happen. We are getting better at evaluating what we're doing, but I think a lot of us are so busy doing the stuff, we aren't necessarily testing if it's actually made a difference. We've got problems around a lot of the way we're giving advice, a lot of advice giving, a lot of mental health advice, a lot of the way that we provide stuff is very westernized. It tends to be based on particular models of mental health. A lot of the solutions we offer are not necessarily culturally diverse, or just appropriate. I think somebody mentioned in the chat a minute ago about communicating with people who speak different languages, say in your family, that there are challenges about if you're given resources you can't access or understand. There's lots of inconsistency. Lots of people are doing lots and lots of stuff, lots of silo working. Unfortunately, a bit of rivalry. I think that you know, when I started doing work on mental health, it's not to say no one was doing it, people were, but the idea of doing it in terms of academia and in a critical way, it was very resisted. I think we are fortunate that things are changing. It might not feel like it for us, but I promise you this is significantly better than even 5 years ago. But I think for some people, it's an opportunity to build a career or a brand, or to be, you know, become a kind of known in the area, and that has caused, I think, some rivalry and tension, and that's a tricky one to sort of work through. And then patchy provision. You know, some universities are great, but some universities aren't. Some departments are good and some people aren't. You might have one brilliant person, and it's probably you, doing something fantastic in your institution, but that means the rest of the place is not dealing with it. So what do we really need to do? We need to think about supervision, better teaching. We need to think about evaluating what we're doing. We need to reflect on it. We need to assess it. We need to be transparent and share. We need to collaborate, and we need to document what we're doing. And as I mentioned, I'm going to give you a link in a minute to a longer piece that talks about that in a bit more detail, because I think when we're talking about advice giving, it's really rubbish if someone comes in and tells you all the stuff you should do and then not how to do it. So I think at the end of this, and when you've read the post I've written, if you're thinking, well, actually, how do we do that in practice? Please just message me and I can help you with that if you want me to. So I think, you know, as I said, this may not seem like it's better, but it is getting better, and we are not going to stop. You know, it's a growing movement, and I think we are aware it needs to change, and we may not all agree on how we want to change it, but I think we are moving forward. So that was the hope I wanted to kind of give you, and I'll finish now, so we've got a few minutes for questions, and I'll give you my email as well, so if there's more questions when we run out of time, you can just send them my way.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Petra. That was a very great talk, and in terms of contextualizing some of the mental health issues in the academic landscape, and kind of thinking about where we've come from and where we're going, and identifying some of the problems that we're facing now. So I think what I would like to do now in the last sort of 5-10 minutes of this session is I'll ask our IT team to stop streaming and to stop recording the session. So if people would like to ask any questions without being recorded, you can do so. And I will now hand it over to Alex to close off this portion of the conference. Thank you very much, Petra, for the discussion, and for everyone who discussed today. I think the chat has been a really fruitful place for discussion, and we will be saving it, and we'll see what we can do about sharing it with people so that we can go back to reflect on some of these points.
Thank you for the insightful talk, Petra, for addressing all the questions in the chat, and for your identification of the importance of actually vetting and evaluating solutions rather than just doing them and doing the work and making these changes without actually understanding the difference between the before and after of the solutions that we implement. So today, this concludes our EDT section of the Minds Conference of 2021. Thank you for all the speakers for generating thoughtful discussions over a variety of topics pertaining to mental health. And thank you to Dragonfly Mental Health for hosting the workshop that kicked off this section, and for your support in bringing this conference together. Thank you to all the attendees for your support and for all your participation. The chat box has been very active throughout all these sessions. We hope that you have learned something new today from the sessions and from each other, and that you can adopt these new lessons to further improve your work in this very important area. So just a reminder, the sessions today have been partially recorded, and subject to the approval of our speakers, they will be made available on our website. We will notify you by email once these are available, and in the meantime, feel free to check out our website where you can find mental health resources from around the world. Finally, we ask that you please provide feedback to us through this short survey, and I'm going to share that in the chat right now. Thank you again for your attendance and active participation. We hope to see you at the next conference block, which will start at 12:10 Pacific time, which is 3:10 Eastern Daylight Time. Thanks, everyone.